What if everything we call truth was never about reality at all, but only about survival? What if truth itself was just a story we kept telling until even we forgot who wrote it? Before Derrida unmasked the instability of meaning, before Baudrillard declared that reality had vanished, before Foucault showed that truth is bound to power, Nietzsche had already opened the abyss. He looked at the idea of truth and saw not a mirror, but a mask. He called it a mobile army of metaphors, illusions that have forgotten. They are illusions, and in that moment, philosophy changed forever. For 2,000 years, thinkers had searched for certainty, some final ground on which knowledge could stand. Nietzsche shattered that hope. He showed that words do not reflect the world, they create it, that every fact is a frozen metaphor, every concept a simplification that life once found useful. And here lies the danger and the freedom. If truth is only a useful fiction, then meaning is no longer given to us, it must be made. That is why this question still burns today. When algorithms define what is real and data replaces judgment, Nietzsche's suspicion toward truth becomes our own dilemma. Because to live in the 21st century is to live inside systems that work. But do we still know why they work? So in this video, we return to the point where philosophy first doubted itself, to see how Nietzsche's doubt became Derrida's deconstruction, and how the world of metaphors turned into the world of code. If that thought already stirs something in you, stay. Because by the end, you might never look at truth the same way again. When Nietzsche wrote those strange words, truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions, he was not being poetic for its own sake. He was declaring war on the very foundation of philosophy. In his short 1873 essay, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, he imagines the human being as a fragile creature, surrounded by chaos. To survive, we invent words, small, shimmering shields, that freeze the flux of reality into stable forms. LEAF, stone, justice, soul. Each is a metaphor carved from the infinite variety of things. With repetition, metaphors ossify into concepts, and concepts become truth. Language, for Nietzsche, is not a mirror of the world, but its architecture. Words do not describe, they legislate. Every sentence is an act of world building, a small law that decides what will count as real. This is why his dream of an Umwertung aller Werte, a revaluation of all values, was never a systematic project, but an experiment in dismantling our oldest linguistic habits. It is what Heidegger would later call methodological nihilism, the courage to think after the collapse of certainty, without immediately rebuilding a new system of belief. He writes, "What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which, after long use, seem firm, canonical, and obligatory. An army, because words conquer. They occupy experience, build their fortresses in grammar, and forget their violent origin. We call this peace, truth. You can see it in history. When Europeans drew their first maps of the New World, they did not discover a continent. They invented it through names: America, the Indies, the West. Whole civilizations were redescribed, reordered, remade. A metaphor, discovery, became a geopolitical fact. The map, as Borges later wrote, began to precede the territory, or think of literature. In 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez shows a town where language gradually loses its reference. Objects must be labeled, chair, door, cow, so people remember what they are. When the words fade, the world itself dissolves. It is exactly Nietzsche's vision. Reality exists only as long as our metaphors hold. A century later, Derrida would call this structure difference, meaning that slides never fixed. The word does not capture the thing, it displaces it. In his Eperons, Spurs, Derrida would even say that Nietzsche never speaks with one voice. His styles multiply like masks, making truth not a unity, but a dance of perspectives. Nietzsche had already glimpsed that motion. And today, in the digital age, we live among new armies of metaphors, algorithms, models, data points. They no longer point to the world, they produce it. A predictive score decides who gets a loan. A trending label defines what becomes visible. The map, again, rules the territory. To realize this is not nihilism, but freedom. Because once we see that every truth is a metaphor that won, we can ask the only question that matters. Which metaphors are still serving us, and which are merely ruling us? If this vision of Nietzsche, the one who saw language itself as our greatest fiction, speaks to you, there's a separate video on this channel devoted to it. It dives deeper into his idea of metaphor and truth, and how that insight still shapes every word we use today. If this idea that words build the world sparked something in you, let me know in the comments. I read them all, and your thoughts often become the seeds of future videos. Nietzsche once said that the human being does not seek truth, but rather the comfort of truth. We crave not accuracy, but orientation. Truth, for him, is not a mirror of the world. It is a tool that helps life go on. He calls it a useful fiction, not because it deceives us, but because it works. The philosopher who asks, "What is truth?" is already too late. The organism has already chosen which illusion helps it survive. In The Gay Science, he writes, "We have arranged for ourselves a world in which we can live, by positing bodies, lines, planes, causes, and effects. But we have not thereby found truth. Truth here is pragmatic, evolutionary, aesthetic, a design that allows the fragile human to endure chaos." This is why Nietzsche breaks the sacred binary, truth/lie. Lies, for him, are not always evil, they can be vital. And truths, when they harden, can become prisons. The moral opposition collapses into something deeper, the struggle of life to shape reality according to its needs. We can see this everywhere. When a nation retells its founding myth, it is not searching for facts, it is securing coherence. When an influencer curates the authentic self, it is not deception, but design, a story that sustains belonging. When a company declares a mission to change the world, it manufactures belief, a fiction that mobilizes energy and money. In each case, truth functions as narrative technology. Nietzsche sensed that civilization itself is held together by these fictions: justice, freedom, equality, even reason. He does not ask us to destroy them, but to know them as creations, so that we may create anew. As he writes, "Without the errors of belief in reality, in being, we could not live." Here the bridge to Derrida becomes clear. If truth is already a fiction that works, then philosophy can no longer seek the final word. It must trace how meaning operates, how interpretation produces stability for a moment, and then slips again. This is why Derrida calls language a play of differences, not falsehood, but motion. And what about ES? We scroll through feeds where facts are ranked by engagement. Each algorithm quietly selects which fiction will appear true today. Foucault would call these arrangements regimes of truth. Baudrillard would add what circulates ES. Our digital world is Nietzsche thought experiment made flesh. The more effective a story, the more real it becomes. Maybe the task is not to hunt for the truth behind these stories, but to ask which fictions expand life and which ones shrink it. Because in the end, Nietzsche's provocation is not cynical, it is creative. If truth is a useful fiction, then creation itself becomes an act of truth-making. And that, perhaps, is the beginning of philosophy. After truth. If these questions keep echoing after the video ends, that's a good sign. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring what holds our world together. When truth starts to slip. Few ideas of Nietzsche so misunderstood as perspectivism. People often reduce it to a slogan, everything is relative, but Nietzsche meant something far more dangerous. He wrote in the Genealogy of Morals, "There is only a perspectival seeing, only a perspectival knowing, and the more effects we allow to speak about a thing, the more complete will our objectivity be." This single line overturns centuries of epistemology. Objectivity, for Nietzsche, is not the absence of perspective. It is the multiplication of perspectives. The strength to incorporate more angles and effects without breaking the form of thought. To see the world as it is a fantasy. There is no view from nowhere. Every vision is angled by desire, language, and power. Even science, which prides itself on neutrality, is a particular way of carving order into chaos, a style of seeing that succeeds because it works, not because it escapes perspective. As Foucault would say, the gaze is trained by an apparatus, practices, and institutions that decide what can appear as visible. Objectivity here is parallax, not revelation. Truth emerges as different sightlines, triangulate a more capacious view, but perspectivism is not relativism. Relativism says all views are equal. Perspectivism says all views are partial, but some see further. Nietzsche's measure is not truth versus falsehood, but strength versus weakness. Strong perspectives create new horizons, weak ones cling to safety and repetition. Perspectivism is a theory of interpretive power. You can feel this in art. Take Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 5 figures fractured into impossible angles. It was not relativism, but a new truth of vision, a recognition that no single gaze can grasp the whole. Or in cinema, think of Kurosawa's Rashomon, where one crime is retold from 4 viewpoints. The point is not that there is no truth, but that truth exists in the interval between views, in the tension of their differences. Modernism, from Cubism onward, breaks the Renaissance fantasy of a single privileged vantage. It stages truth as composition across angles. In our time, perspectivism has become the hidden logic of digital life. Every feed is a private reality tunnel, an algorithmic perspective tuned to our behavior. We no longer share one world, but millions of micro-worlds, each curated by data. The danger Nietzsche saw in the philosopher's single truth is now mirrored in the engineer's personalized truth. When everyone lives in their own feed, perspectivism without self-awareness becomes mass relativism. Your feed is not a window, it is a mirror, cued by your gestures. That is why Nietzsche insisted on rank, not as a hierarchy of people, but a vision. A higher spirit is one that can endure contradiction, that can hold many angles without collapsing into cynicism. Perspectivism demands strength of interpretation, the courage to see from several positions, and still create meaning. Here, Zizek's idea of a parallax gap is helpful. The truth is not behind the views, but in their irreducible shift. Here, Derrida picks up the thread. His difference is not a flight from truth, but a discipline of seeing how truth emerges between signs. Every interpretation traces what it excludes. Every center depends on its margin. Nietzsche intuits this structure in his Perspectivism. Derrida gives it a grammar and an ethics of responsibility to other perspectives. If the question of how power conditions what we can see intrigues you, I unfold it further in the video on Foucault. So the question for us is not whether truth exists, but whether we can see through our own angle. To know one's perspective is already to begin philosophy, because, as Nietzsche warned, beware of those who want to eradicate your instincts of interpretation. They want to turn you into a machine of truth. Maybe the task now is the opposite, to become artists of perspective, not victims of it. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. Share this video with someone who also wonders whether our productivity is just a new kind of faith. In the third essay of the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche dissects what he calls the ascetic ideal, the belief that life finds its highest value, not in living, but in denying life. He saw it everywhere, in priests who praise suffering, in philosophers who worship pure reason, in scientists who sacrifice joy for objectivity. At its core, the ascetic ideal is a strange bargain. Life convinces itself that it can justify existence only by turning against itself. Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. That, Nietzsche says, is the deepest instinct of the human animal. When deprived of meaning, it prefers guilt to emptiness. The ascetic ideal transforms the pursuit of truth into a moral duty. We are told that the highest virtue is to seek truth at any cost. But why should this search be holy? For Nietzsche, it is the continuation of religious self-denial by other means. The philosopher as monk of reason, flagellating himself for the sake of purity. He warns, behind the mask of devotion to truth often hides the old craving for power, the will to rule through knowledge, to impose one's interpretation as the universal one. The scientist's laboratory, the scholar's desk, the data analyst's dashboard, each can become a monastery where meaning is measured by obedience to method. Here the bridge to Foucault appears. Foucault shows how the modern world inherited this ascetic discipline and secularized it. Power no longer needs confession before God. It asks for confession to the system. We log our sleep, track our calories, optimize our attention, a digital monasticism of self-measurement. The ideal of truth becomes an algorithmic faith. To know is to be counted. Nietzsche saw the danger early. He wrote, "The ascetic ideal has meant so much to man because it was the only meaning he could still will. When truth becomes a moral absolute, questioning, it feels like sin, and so entire cultures repeat the ascetic gesture, punishing doubt, sanctifying suffering, demanding transparency in place of trust. Look around, the influencer who preaches authentic productivity, the startup that promises self-optimization, the citizen who monitors every heartbeat in the name of health. Each reenacts the old drama, the will to truth as the will to control. The ascetic ideal did not vanish with religion. It changed its vocabulary. We no longer confess to priests, we confess to devices. We no longer seek salvation, we seek data-driven perfection. Truth has become a ritual of performance. As Baudrillard would say, we have entered the stage where confession becomes simulation. We display sincerity as proof of authenticity. And this is Nietzsche's critique matters today. He invites us to reverse the direction, to see knowledge not as purification, but as creation. Truth, stripped of its moral halo, can become an artistic act, the courage to interpret, to invent, to affirm life, rather than negate it. Even Heidegger, reading Nietzsche, saw in this reversal the end of metaphysics, not destruction, but a turning, kera, from truth as correctness to truth as unconcealment, as an event of creation. And Derrida, in his late writings, echoes it. The most faithful reading of truth is not obedience, but invention, a responsibility for what we make appear. Because every time we obey the demand, be transparent, be correct, be measurable. We might remember Nietzsche's whisper, perhaps the highest honesty is not obedience to truth, but the strength to create it. If this idea, the strange alliance between faith, data, and discipline, fascinates you, you can explore it deeper in my video on Foucault. Power is everywhere, where I trace how modern forms of confession became the machinery of control. Algorithms decide what you see, but not yet what you seek. Tap the bell and let the next video find you before the feed does. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche performs one of his sharpest dissections of Western thought. He names the 4 great errors that have kept humanity enslaved to metaphysics. Each error is not a simple mistake of logic, but a symptom of our longing for certainty, our refusal to accept the innocence of becoming. He writes, "The world seen through the eyes of reason is a fable. The moral world order is an illusion." 1. The error of confusing cause and effect. We love to believe that behind every event, there is a clear cause. If someone suffers, we assume they must have done something wrong. If we are successful, we imagine it's because we were virtuous. Nietzsche calls this a moralization of causality, an inheritance from theology. The sinner causes his pain, the saint causes his reward. But life, he insists, does not operate by such neat equations. Suffering is not punishment. It is part of the flux of forces. The meaning we attach to pain is a human projection, a way to make chaos appear just. He writes, "The cause of suffering is not the same as the meaning of suffering." In other words, we invent meaning after the fact. We dress pain in metaphysics to make it bearable. To recognize this is to remove the last mask of resentment, the reactive impulse that turns experience into moral judgment. Deleuze will later call these reactive forces energies that act only through negation, incapable of creating, but skilled at condemning. 2. The error of false causality. When something happens, we rush to claim control. I chose this. But Nietzsche calls this another illusion, the superstition of the subject. We imagine an inner agent, a little I behind every act, as if will and deed were separable. In truth, the deed is the doer. The self is not the cause, but the effect, a grammatical residue. He says with irony, "There is no being behind doing. The doing is everything." This insight anticipates both Spinoza's critique of free will and Freud's discovery of the unconscious. The realization that consciousness is not sovereign, but downstream from hidden forces. Later, Derrida will recognize in this the same structure of difference. Every origin already bears the trace of its effects. 3. The error of imaginary causes. Humans prefer any explanation to none. When thunder strikes, the ancients heard Zeus. When tragedy strikes today, we invoke karma, or the market. We cannot stand uncertainty, so we invent spirits, systems, or statistics to comfort ourselves. Nietzsche calls this the infantile stage of reason, the need for a story where there is only chance. Even now, in the digital age, we see this reflex. The algorithm becomes our new oracle. If a post goes viral, we speak of the algorithm's favor as if code were a divine intelligence, rewarding merit. Our old gods have become mathematical. Baudrillard would say, "We no longer believe in destiny, only in data." 4. The error of free will. Perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all, the belief that we are autonomous authors of our fate. For Nietzsche, free will was invented by priests to justify punishment. If you could have acted otherwise, you deserve to suffer. He flips the concept. Freedom is not the opposite of necessity. It is the dance within it. A strong spirit affirms the necessity of its path. It does not beg to rewrite it. The wise man says yes to all that is, he writes, the formula of amor fati, love of one's fate. Here, Nietzsche restores will to life itself. Freedom, he suggests, is not a metaphysical privilege, but an aesthetic capacity, the power to shape one's necessity, as one shapes a poem. Heidegger would later call this the freeing of freedom from the will. Each of these errors is a philosophical X-ray. It shows how much of what we call morality rests on fear of chaos, of contingency, of innocence. We invent causes, subjects, and moralities to protect ourselves from the thought that things simply happen. But Nietzsche's aim is not to humiliate reason, it is to free it. He does not destroy causality. He releases it from theology. He does not abolish will. He returns it to life. And here again, we glimpse the prefiguration of deconstruction. Derrida too will show that meaning is never anchored, that every cause is already an effect, every origin already a trace. Foucault will extend this to history itself. There is no master cause, only dispersed genealogies of power and knowledge. Nietzsche had seen it all a century earlier, hidden in the metaphysical grammar of our thought. To live without these four errors is to stand naked before the flux, to say yes to a world without guarantees, without why. That is not despair, that is strength. And maybe that's why we still cling to our causes, our data, our dashboards. We would rather be explained than free. If you want to see how this courage, to live without why, unfolds in the modern world, you can continue with my video on Baudrillard, where the old metaphysical causes dissolve into code, and yet the question of meaning still refuses to die. If this journey stayed with you, leave a comment, subscribe, or share it. It helps the channel grow, yes, but more than that, it keeps philosophy alive. One question at a time. Nietzsche never saw a screen, yet he foresaw our world more clearly than many futurists. He warned that when truth dies as correspondence, something else will rise in its place. Not chaos, but management. When no God guarantees meaning, we build systems that simulate it. Today, those systems have names: algorithm, model, data. We have not abolished the search for truth, we have automated it. In Nietzsche's time, the ascetic ideal demanded faith in the purity of knowledge. In ours, it demands faith in the neutrality of technology. The laboratory has become the server farm. The monk has become the data scientist. Both perform the same ritual, purifying noise into pattern, uncertainty into prediction. But prediction is not understanding, it is power, disguised as truth. Michel Foucault would recognize this immediately. He showed that every regime of knowledge is a regime of power, that truth is produced within networks that decide what can be said, who can speak, and what counts as evidence. Today, those networks are not universities or churches, they are platforms. When an algorithm curates your feed, it does not ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Will this keep you here?" Utility replaces veracity. We enter the age of performative truth, truth that exists only by the metrics of its visibility. Baudrillard would call this the hyperreal, a space where the sign no longer points to reality, but produces it. The trending hashtag becomes the event. The simulation precedes the fact. The question, "Is it true?" becomes irrelevant. The only question is, does it circulate? If this idea fascinates you, that reality may already have dissolved into its own images, I explore it deeply in my video on Baudrillard. Nietzsche anticipated this reversal. He saw that once we abandon truth as correspondence, we begin to measure it by effect. He wrote, "Truth is that kind of error without which a certain species could not live." Our digital world takes this literally. The truth is whatever sustains engagement. Even Derrida would hear here an industrialization of difference, the play of difference, scaled by code. Zizek notes that ideology today works not by deceiving us, but by giving us what we already desire. We know the feed manipulates us, and we scroll anyway. Like Nietzsche's priest, the algorithm does not hide its power. It invites our consent to it. We become confessors to code, and yet there is also potential here. If meaning is generated, not discovered, then perhaps the digital is not the end of truth, but its new theater. In the flux of signs, we can still create. Every meme, every story, every act of reinterpretation is a small affirmation, a will to power transposed into code. But Nietzsche would ask, who commands this new ARMY of metaphors? Who shapes the language through which the world appears? If we do not create the meanings we live by, someone, or something, will do it for us. That is the echo of his death of God. When no transcendent truth remains, responsibility returns to us. If this question, what happens after the death of God, still haunts you, I dedicated an entire video to it in the Nietzsche playlist. So the question returns, sharper than ever, do we still interpret, or are we merely interpreted? Because in the digital age, the war for truth has not ended. It has simply changed terrain, from the battlefield of ideas to the battlefield of attention. If truth has died, what takes its place? Nietzsche's answer was never despair. He wrote, "We have art, lest we perish of the truth." When the heavens of certainty collapse, creation begins. After the death of God, after every absolute fades, there remains the human being who still says yes. Yes to confusion. Yes to becoming. Yes to the possibility of making meaning anew. The philosopher's task is no longer to find truth, but to give style to existence, to transform chaos into form. This is the secret continuity between Nietzsche and Derrida. Where Nietzsche saw the world as a battlefield of interpretations, Derrida saw language itself as the theater of that battle. Meaning, he says, is always deferred, not lost, but forever on the move, born in the gap between signs. What survives after truth is not silence, it is difference, the restless life of meaning that refuses to be fixed. The world does not need another foundation. It needs readers, interpreters, creators, those who can dance in uncertainty, without demanding a final ground. Nietzsche called them the free spirits. Derrida called them the responsible readers. Both mean the same, those who can bear the trembling of meaning, and still create beauty from it. Look at our own time. Facts collapse into feeds, ideologies melt into trends, and yet people write, paint, sing, fall in love, interpret. Life goes on, not because it finds truth, but because it invents it again and again. In this sense, creation is the last metaphysics we have left, and perhaps the most honest one. Even Heidegger, reflecting on Nietzsche's revaluation of all values, saw in art not escape but revelation, truth as unconcealment, not as possession. And Breidaughty or Sloterdijk would later call this the post-human continuation of that same impulse, creation as an act of becoming beyond the human, not as mastery, but as metamorphosis. As Derrida once said, deconstruction is not the end of the world, but the beginning of responsibility. To live after truth means to live responsibly within interpretation, to know that our words shape the world we share. Nietzsche would call that courage. Derrida would call it care. So what survives after truth? The same thing that began before it, the human capacity to mean, to speak, to imagine, to create fictions that do not enslave but open. And maybe that is the quiet promise that runs through both of them, that even when the gods and certainties fall, meaning does not die. It transforms from revelation into relation, from foundation into conversation. If this idea resonates with you, that philosophy begins not in answers, but in the courage to keep asking. You can explore it further in my videos on Derrida, Foucault, and Baudrillard. Together, they form a small atlas of how modern thought learned to live after truth. Because after the death of truth, philosophy doesn't end, it begins. If you've made it this far, perhaps some part of you already knew that truth was never a wall, but a mirror, slowly fading until you see yourself behind it. Philosophy begins there, in that quiet moment when we stop asking, what is true? And start asking, what can I create from this? If this reflection stayed with you, share it. Let it move through others. And when you're ready to go deeper, you'll find the next step waiting in the videos on Derrida, Foucault, and Baudrillard. Until then, keep questioning, because every question you keep alive is already a form of freedom. And if this video spoke to you, leave a comment. Tell me what part resonated most. It helps me more than you imagine, not just with the algorithm, but as a sign that these ideas matter, that they're finding their way. Your thoughts keep this channel alive. So if you haven't yet, subscribe. Share it with a friend who loves to think deeply. And help me build a space where philosophy still breathes. Not as a subject, but as a conversation